Hello, everybody, and welcome to Lore Lords. That's right, Lore Lords, the first of the new year. Happy New Year, everybody. And what a better way to start it than talking about something that's near and dear to everyone's hearts, because you grew up in America, and if you didn't grow up in America, then where'd you grow up? Literally, tell us where you grew up.
Somewhere wrong.
Somewhere wrong, and that doesn't have burgers. Only America has burgers.
Yeah, true.
It's true.
Hey everyone, welcome back. You probably don't know this if you're listening to this not live, but we haven't been here in what, like 3 weeks?
Two? Really?
Has it been 2?
Is it only?
It feels longer, but it might have just been 2. We had a little Christmas, New Year's break, and we're back. This is the first episode of 2023.
That is correct.
Yeah, so that's pretty cool. And it's a different type. So when me and Pat threw the idea of Lore Lords around, this episode was one of my first ideas.
This is true. And when you brought it up the other day again, it was like a memory came back from so long ago.
Yeah. I have like, every time I do an episode, or even when you do an episode, I categorize it in my head. Like, this is a true crime episode. This is a supernatural episode. This is an anime episode. This is a video game episode. This is a fictional lore episode. That kind of stuff. Like, or a history one. Like, I have all these things. This is the first one of a new category, which is food.
Yeah.
If you're watching live, you can tell by the dancing cheeseburger on stream what this is about. Probably already. This is about where burgers come from, what they are. And the reason why I thought this would be an interesting thing originally is because I already knew ahead of time that this is an extremely controversial subject. Right.
Because every time I say America invented the cheeseburger, Germans get incredibly angry with me.
Yeah. And there is, we'll learn about that. We'll learn whether there's an answer tonight. I'm pretty sure everyone loves food, so people like. I figured one of my favorite things about Lore Lords and having people listen to Lore Lords is you can bring up a fun fact to someone else.
Oh my god, am I going to order McDonald's by the end of this?
There's a chance. I like being able to spread fun facts, and then one day when you're like out getting a burger, you can be like, "Excuse me, did you know burgers are actually from?" and put your glasses up with your friends. Sound like an idiot, but you'll be impressive. Trust me, they're never going to forget that fun fact.
I'm already resisting the urge. Okay.
Oh, trust me. While I was doing the research for this, I wanted a burger every day for 2 weeks. So it was rough. But yes, as an American, kind of like you mentioned before, this is one of our most staple foods, and you can't really escape being around the cheeseburger or the hamburger, right? Everywhere you go, there's a burger place. You don't have to eat them, but you're still near them. And now, if you're a vegetarian or a vegan, there's just as many like options for that now. Anyway,
it's true.
So it's like you can still get they're pretty good. Some of them are fantastic.
Agreed.
And it's a very popular thing, and it all comes. This is one of the, I would say, the number one thing of American cuisine. I think you could say that safely. If you think American food, you probably think burgers. Like that's probably my number one thing.
And KFC is probably the second thing.
Yeah, KFC is pretty high up there. And even though I know I probably shouldn't say this, pizza. But
right, I love pizza though.
But which brings me to my next point: is that in American cuisine, it all comes from somewhere or in something else. Nothing's original in American cuisine. We all have our food comes from different cultures mixing together, much like cryptids, right?
I would also like to point out, because you're right, there is no original food really in America. Not really that many. I think there's like a handful, but like we do a damn good job at making it better.
Well, we'll talk about whether that's true or not soon.
It depends on what we're talking about.
But like the way the burger is today is an American invention. I'll say that. Way the worldwide burger today. So it just depends on what you want to describe or define things as, really, I guess.
Well, I like American pizza better than Italian pizza.
Yeah, 100%. 100%. That's what I was kind of trying to say. It's like we have our own versions of things that have become the worldwide popular version. So everyone will always argue, "Oh, it's not from America." Shush. Shush.
Perfected. It was
Yeah.
perfected here.
You know, in America, there's 50 billion hamburgers sold from restaurants annually.
50 billion annually?
Yeah,
Okay. I had to sit there for a second. Got it. That's a
it's a
lot.
lot of burgers. It's a lot of cheeseburgers, and the rest of the world is up to like 20 billion annually. So we are more than the rest of the world, but you know, it's obviously a lot more popular here than anywhere else.
Right.
We have other places they make burgers, and they have like McDonald's and stuff. That's probably where most of it comes from, I'm assuming, especially because if they're recording the numbers, it's probably like McDonald's sales, right? Or Burger Kings and stuff like that. So for today's foray into the food world, we're going to be going back to the start with a history lesson, as we always do, about where things come from, what its likely origin is, and where we got the cheeseburger we have today.
All right, everybody. Blue Skidoo, we can too. It's time to get started.
Part 1, the beef. So, while
Adam. Sorry.
the cheeseburger, shout outs to my only beef in my life. So while the cheeseburger is an American staple today, it's obviously got its origins elsewhere, you know.
Right.
And we're going back to a cuneiform tablet of ancient Mesopotamia
Wow.
that tells us of
Holy shit.
cattle ranching, how to butcher a cow, how to get the beef, and how to grind it up. And this is 10,000 years ago. So people were already grinding beef 10,000 years ago.
Take that, Germany.
So, yeah, Iraq started it. We don't currently have any more information on the preparation of this at the moment. There's no tablet going further in detail than basic cattle ranching and beef being eaten. So people did farm cows and eat their beef in ancient Mesopotamia, at least. But we do have another stop in the ancient era, in the Roman Empire.
Oh.
Because ancient Rome was liked to write things down, and they had something called the Apicius Cookbook, which has been cited in a lot of his food history stuff.
Terrible name, though.
Apicius, maybe. Yeah, it does have piss in it. I hope it's. It doesn't. Maybe they cook with piss.
That was the early oil, I guess.
Yeah, that's how they. That's like. It's like those videos in. Have you seen the videos of the Chinese food carts? Where they just get the oil out of the street gutter.
Oh.
Yeah,
Oh no.
Anyway, it's Apicius. So I said Apicius. Apicius, maybe. But knowing how like they said things in ancient Rome, it sounds like I think it's Apicius.
I'm thinking Apicius, baby.
But yeah, there's a dish in this book called Icicia Ominata. Icicia Omentata.
You calling me a sissy?
Yeah. Okay. Also, what it is that it's a baked patty of minced beef with pine kernels, black and green peppercorn, and white wine.
Ooh. Oh wow! I like the white wine. It's just like
so that's the ingredients. Well, I think you pour it in the meat when you're making the patty.
Right.
Okay. So that's literally a burger patty. That's just like how you make it today. Pepper, and others like pepper, like black pepper and salt and beef is how you make a burger patty today. This had pine kernels, which I'm not sure what that is. Pine nuts, I'm guessing, and then white wine.
That's fine.
Yeah, that's just a burger patty. That's a burger patty. So Romans were one of the first civilizations to serve food ever. They would not, because a lot of places had inns and taverns, but they would sell basic foods like bread and cheese to go with and stuff like that, with wine and ale. But Rome actually had market stalls with seating areas where you would order ready-made prepared food and sit down to eat it, which is a precursor to a modern restaurant. They may have even had them, we just don't understand.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of what it is.
Yeah, there has to be a certain level of like comfort in society for there to be restaurants. And at least in the Roman big cities, we know they had high levels of comfort and stuff clean water and things like that. And air conditioning, yeah. So, they had restaurants a little bit. It's likely people were frying up basic hamburger patties like we talked about and serving them in some manner in Rome, at least, in the other big cities, as far back as the 4th century CE. Once Rome fell, it seems to have stopped. Like, no more burger patties. And the Eastern Roman Empire, aka Byzantium, did not keep up with this dish. We have a lot of their food would become what we have as of Turkish and Mediterranean food today, not burger patties. So, they lost a lot of that. But to keep looking at the history of the burger, we need to specifically look at the main ingredient to see when it would become what we know today, which is ground beef. So if we're following the history of cows and beef, after Rome, grinding beef was very rare because most people would not eat cows. And as they were more valuable for their milk, people wouldn't want to kill their milk gaining source. And they would really only eat beef when it was dying, like it either hurt itself and died, or when the bulls would get too old to mate. They could slaughter them and eat them, So it wasn't something that was super readily available. And most people ate mutton, pork, and rich people ate chicken, and poor people ate fish. That's basically that was most medieval food. And medieval cookbooks exist. There's tons of medieval cookbooks.
Oh yeah.
And they rarely mention mincing any meat. And if so, it's usually mutton. That's what mint. Because the term mincemeat or mince today in a lot of Europe means mutton, which is goat or sheep.
That would be a fun show. We should try to find a medieval cookbook and we all cook something and film it.
Absolutely would love to do that. 100%, I'm down.
We should do that. That sounds awesome.
So red meat in general was saved for the higher classes. Peasants would usually eat fresh fish for their protein. And when...
Still.
No, the peasant diet is what would be the rich diet today. 100%. The roles have reversed. Peasant diets back then was freshly made, non-processed bread. So like brown bread. Freshly made cheese. It hadn't been processed because it was fresh. The processed stuff would be sold to the rich. So you would have fresh made cheese, and then you would have water from running water or homemade ale or wine. So like it's all was fresh made things. The knight class would usually eat deer. That was like their number one thing because they would go hunting. That was like their big thing, right? So they go hunt it out and eat deer or fish, sometimes pork. And the rich people ate like chicken.
Deer's not that good for you though. Yeah, chicken's good for you.
Chicken was like the rich people's big food because you could afford to eat your egg maker. That was like you showed off by eating chicken. Like I can kill a chicken. Look how rich I am.
Wow, that's so shitty.
Yeah.
But it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
I can kill my egg maker. That's what I call my mom.
Yeah, so when meat is instructed to be minced or ground, the end result is almost always sausage as well. That's like what he did. Because sausage not only tasted good, but this was the primary way to preserve your meat back then. Other methods, your meat would go bad because there's no refrigeration. So people they turn everything to sausage. Most medieval families in Europe would have a single pig that they would fatten all year round, butcher it before winter, turn it into sausage to last almost until next winter. Probably got pretty rough. Pretty soon, yeah. I could imagine. Again, no refrigeration. Sausage had casings on it, usually made out of the stomach like linings. Fantastic. But it didn't last that long. It's still the casing is still organics, so it won't last that long. But as mentioned before, in between that, they'd eat like fish and bread and cheese, drink water, homemade ales. If you had a farm with livestock, such as pigs, goat, or sheep, you'd probably eat those more frequently than other peasants. But cattle ranching at the time was a very difficult profession.
I imagine.
You can just imagine how massive a cow is in a bowl. That's not easy to manage. And they would take up a lot more land and produce a lot more waste than simple sheep or pigs.
But you gather the poop and sell that, and there you go, fertilizer business, boom.
Yeah, which did not until the next age. That was a Renaissance, like 1800s technology. People didn't realize what fertilizer was. So, during this time, you couldn't use it that much. But steak and beef would be extremely rare, and it would be used by nobles at the time because they were the ones who would buy cow just to slaughter. There was not as many cows as we have today, Cows were extremely rare, and when one would die of age or accident, like I said, you'd eat it, but usually even then you would just sell the meat, because you'd make way more money selling the meat to rich families than eating it yourself.
So a lot of meat, too.
So either Rome was better at cattle ranching, or they just had enough people in the big cities that were well off enough to afford beef, So that's just a weird thing to think about because it doesn't add up. I'm guessing they just had a lot more cattle ranching because they also had a lot more area. Like Spain had a lot of cattle ranches in the Roman Empire, so they could just get it imported from there, I guess. But this begs us to ask, when does eating beef as a common thing show up again in history? And that would be when the world starts getting better off for health and money reasons. We see it show up again in Germany. In the 17th century, we see a food item known as frikadelle. Or frikadelle, I believe is one of those two. If you look this up today, you can Google it. It's Frikadelle. It's just a hamburger patty. That's all it is. Exactly how we see it today. It's just ground beef molded into a disc with salt and pepper and burned. And then you would do this because you could store it. Because again, the more you cook the meat, the longer it lasts. So you could store this for like a whole weekend. You could have these burger patties, and you could also kind of eat them. You could carry a bunch of them in like a basket and bring it to like a group, and there's a bunch of food for everybody. This dish specifically comes from the region of Hamburg, but more on that later. Ground beef appears again in the form of steak tartare in French, British, and American culture in the 19th century. And if you don't know, this is a dish of raw ground beef with onions, mushroom, pepper, Worcestershire sauce, and often an egg raw put on top of it.
Cook that sounds really good, but raw, no. But
I've had it before, and I think it's amazing. I love it. If you haven't tried it, I do recommend trying it. But it's not for everybody, for sure. Just like a sushi's not for everybody, tartare is not for everybody. This dish in this style that I just mentioned was invented by the French and is still very popular today. But I do want to mention as a side note for people who will yell at me that tartare is not made by the French. It is probably made by the Mongolians, and it goes back ages and ages and ages ago. If you don't know, in the medieval ages, the Mongolians are referred to as the Tartars. And that is where this likely thing kind of comes from. That also is possibly not true and a racist connection, but we're going to go further beyond that. Anyway, we do know that the book Michael Strogoff by Jules Verne in 1875 mentions them eating tartar in the olden days. So we know that at least at the beginning of 1800s, they were eating beef in this manner.
right.
But during the 19th century, in the Victorian era, we did have a huge boom in European immigration to the United States from Germany, due to the 39 German states confederating into the Germany we kind of know today, which would become the German Empire, which we actually talked about in the World War I episode for Veterans Day in November.
Oh.
So if you want to go back and listen to that, more details on what happened to Germany then. But because of that, a lot of people got worried, and they didn't like being the same countrymen as their neighboring country at the time, like Bohemians and Bavarians and Saxons, so they all moved to America, a lot of them, and they would mostly settle in the port city of New York City. Restaurants opened up in New York City selling the native cuisine from Germany, and one popular item was the Hamburg-style American filet, it would often be listed as a beefsteak a la Hambourgeoisie.
Bourgeoisie. Down with the bourgeoisie.
Down with the bourgeoisie, I guess. This was done often not by the Germans, but by Americans trying to sell food to the immigrants from Hamburg to get business from these new German immigrants. And it would be, what this item is, basically, is a ground beef steak served with potatoes. Cooked rare or not cooked at all. Sometimes it's often served raw with a brown kind of like sauce drizzled on top. And that was the popular way to serve it.
Why did it take so long for people to put bread? It took so long to be like, put it in bread.
We'll talk about bread in a minute. This dish popularized ground beef for basically the first time in America, and it would become a much more common thing to see. And during this time of the Victorian era in Europe and America, restaurants boomed for the first time ever. So this is when people had money to spend on meals over previous eras. So restaurants started showing up on corners, cafes started showing up everywhere. Bigger cities, you had a lot more. The restaurant industry basically started in this like kind of 1860s and so on. And
I
this,
love restaurants. Oh God, I love eating
yeah,
out. Anyway,
absolutely. One of my favorite things to do in life. So steak gained its popularity during this time as well. And as it remained today to be a famously like the best cut of meat to get, steak dinner. And that became very popular all over America as well as steakhouses. But beef isn't the only part of a hamburger. And I'd argue you don't have one until you have the one other part at least, and that's the bun.
oh, thank God we're getting there. I was just freaking out about it.
So there's a lot of controversy as well about when sandwiches started being a thing. But what we do know for a fact is that the word sandwich is not recorded in history regarding food until the 18th century. And many cultures today claim they invented the sandwich. The idea of food between bread is probably a much older concept to be realized because it just makes sense.
So.
Yeah, it probably goes back to ancient era, and it was always done and was such a normal thing. People didn't think about it. People might not have written down about it a lot because it's just if you always had bread with your meat and your cheese.
Right.
There's no way people weren't eating it together on bread. Like, there's no way.
Right. It's the simplest thing.
Yeah. So, but, as far as we go for recorded history, the term itself is credited to John Montagu, the fourth Earl of Sandwich, who would eat sandwiches so he could play cards without soiling his fingers. And this happened in the year 1765.
Dude, I get that. That's how I game, brother.
Yeah. So, obviously the word sandwich has to have some connection to the area of sandwich. Like that it has to be connected in some way. So sure, John Montagu, the fourth Earl of Sandwich, invented sandwiches, whatever. So it shows up again in 1840, where Elizabeth Leslie Cook had a sandwich recipe in her cookbook, which was an American cookbook. And in that cookbook, it references the sandwich as the most popular item of American cuisine, or of United States cuisine. So we know that in the 1800s, by 1840, sandwiches were everywhere in America.
I can imagine sandwiches, because this is a very American thing, like, were easy for soldiers to eat because it's like, all right, like, okay, here, make a quick sandwich for the soldiers.
100%. 100%.
Like,
soldiers, and talking about eating it while playing cards, the Wild West was during that time. So people were playing poker like crazy and riding a horse and all this, doing stuff. It makes sense. Sandwiches are perfect to-go meals. You wrap it up in your little lunch cloth and you have a little sandwich, So it makes sense for that to be popular out here.
And what's a bigger country for to-go kind of people than America?
Exactly.
That's right.
Exactly.
That's right.
So in this time, we also saw the hamburg steak become popular on menus all over New York City.
Oh, well, there it is.
This dish, again, it's a patty with ground beef, egg, onion, and a variety of seasonings, fried and served alongside pickles or potatoes, or served raw. But when you fried it, I want to point this out, it was only too rare. You would never cook a hamburg steak more than rare, which barely means it's cooked. That's important for going forward.
It's like heated.
Yeah, basically. It's like it's heated. So another variation of this was to have it lightly salted with breadcrumbs on top and then served raw, which was very similar to a tartare, just with breadcrumbs on top. The oldest documentation is a printed menu from a place called Delmonico's Restaurant in 1873. And the menu states that for 11 cents, you can get a hamburg steak developed by American chef Charles Ranhofer.
11 cents, huh?
Yeah. And at this time, 11 cents was an insanely high price for food.
Oh, I'm sure.
Which tells us that this dish was served to high-end people in high-end restaurants. And a steak, like a prime cut of steak that we would have today for a steak dinner for like $25 was 5 cents to 6 cents at the time. So this hamburg steak was being sold for 11 cents.
Yeah.
So that's more than double the price of like a perfect cut of meat, So that tells you that this was a fancy ass meal to get this hamburg steak.
I just want burgers. Okay.
So late 19th century America saw cattle ranching hit a new high, which meant more cows, which meant lower cost of beef. What this did was turn the hamburg steak into a popular dish for rich people into a popular dish nationwide because it suddenly was very low cost to make. and low effort because you weren't cooking it really. You were just barely,
Right.
cooking it. This dish appears in almost every cookbook at the time, from New York to California. So around the late 19th century, it spread nationwide. Hospitals even document showing the Hamburg steak being served to patients as early as 1887, being raw or lightly cooked, beef patty with raw egg on top. So that was a
protein's not
yeah.
bad for you.
So that was a popular hospital. Actually, well, if a hospital is making it, that's a good way to show that it's such a widely known item
Right.
that any patient will be like, "Oh yeah, Hamburg steak." Like, yeah, I'll have it. Kind of thing.
Right.
Now we're gonna go into part 2, which I titled "Where's the Burger?"
Where is it?
And it's
Show me the
about
burger.
to get absolutely out of control. And it's extremely hard to find any answers digging in this area. But
This is
what?
This has
Yeah.
been such a calm experience so far, so I'm excited to find out how it gets out of control.
I mean, out of control with like the fact that you can't get a fucking answer.
Right.
We're still going to talk about the beef industry for a second because it's very important to now get into the founding of what we have today as a hamburger.
Sure.
In the 1800s, a German engineer named Karl Dreis invented the meat grinder.
Right.
By 1845, this item was all over the world, and Americans would make many improvements to this device. And this is important because before this, to grind beef, you had to chisel it by hand with a chisel,
Yeah,
which
that's-
is, yes, cows are big, and a beefsteak is very big, and to grind all of that by hand would be exhausting, which is another reason why no one ate beef. The Romans must have fucking killed it, dude. Like, I don't know what they were doing with their meat grinding, but they must have had some kind of meat grinder. But this led to the popularization of the Hamburg steak because people were able to now grind beef, like we just talked about. Late 1800s, meat grinders are everywhere. And there's even a brand called the American Chopper that would be endorsed publicly by a man named Dr. Salisbury, which we'll talk about again in a second. So we understand in the 1800s now, based on what we talked about, why beef got popular. And we also mentioned how the Hamburg steak would change over time and start to look a lot less like, the Hamburg, Germany beef, which is, that we talked about earlier. So easy access to ground meat also opened the door for classic American food like hot dogs and meatloaf, but that leaves us with the star, still waiting for its debut. Hot dogs were starting to spread around. That's an easy thing to trace back to bratwurst. I don't need to do an episode on that. That's just German sausages becoming cheaper and easier to make in America.
Totally.
So the hamburger and meatloaf, of course, is just ground beef. That's the easiest thing to do with ground beef. You just make a meatloaf, you just cover it in tomato sauce and bake it. So where's the burger starting? Cattle ranching was drastically increasing, and the cattle industry boomed like absolutely out of control. And in the 1880s actually is known historically as the golden age of beef. And we actually saw the construction of many railroads that we use today that was built just specifically to move beef across the country so it wouldn't go bad.
Oh God. Okay.
So when the beef industry had all these railroads start to connect America a lot, steak and beef became the most commonly ate meat in the United States all over. And the late 1800s also had the invention of refrigeration. So now these refrigerated train carts were able to move this stuff even further around. And now what was very common in Texas as a steakhouse became common in places like, New York and the East Coast and the South, where you didn't have open pastoral land, And another thing that popped up is that seafood places that existed all around the coast, specifically California and New England, started to now sell steak because it was just so popular. And to stay in business and compete, they had to keep doing it. And
Makes sense.
this was where the term surf and turf was coined.
Oh yeah, I remember like growing up, going to like any bar or pub. There's always like a bunch of seafood meals, and then this is years and years later, but it's still just such a common thing. There's the surf and turf. There's always steak.
Yeah. So,
Also, great steak tips.
oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Big meat started to form. It was extremely powerful at this time, and it was the end of the era where we met high levels of corruption and scandals in the big meat industry. And shortcuts started being made, which was threatened quality and hygiene of meat. And in 1900, a book came out by a man named Upton Sinclair called The Jungle, which highlighted the issues of the meat industry, which led to the FDA creating what is known as the Pure Food and Drug Act. So this may sound like a side tangent, but this is extremely important to why we have burgers, because this led to people in restaurant chains having to improve the safety of their cooked meat. So popular restaurants had to change their ways, and because awareness was spread by this book, people were losing business. Like places were even shutting down just because there wasn't enough customers for their meat products, because people were afraid of meat now. And the actual origin is unknown, which you're going to go into next, but people from all over the USA claim to invent it, all over the world claim to invent it, but from my research, it is likely that it occurred during this era, from 1900 to 1904 was the first burger, maybe going back to 1885 to 1904, if I'm being generous. But I say 1900, 1904 because food industries had to change the standards of how food was made due to that book happening and FDA being more involved now. And this mass phobia of medium or rare or raw meat was kind of still around today. A lot of people, like when I was a kid, my mom only cooked meat well done because she was afraid of me dying from eating meat that wasn't well done.
My mom had a brief period of that too. Then she got over it and was like, eat it this way. And
it lasted almost 100 years, this fear of eating medium meat. So this phobia would take place in restaurants, and people who would ground their beef, form it into patties, and start to cook it well done instead of the Hamburg steak, which is either raw or very rare. So this meant they had very bland and overcooked meat that needed something else. So they put on the extremely popular condiment ketchup at the time to add flavor. And the next was people were even afraid to touch meat with their hands without having to wash their hands afterwards. And public restrooms weren't as common as a thing back then. So they put it on a bun. And this became a very popularized thing all over America, which is great. That's how it formed in theory, to me, looking at everything, seeing it pop up places. But who did it first? Well, part 3, controversy. As we talked about, a lot of people claimed to make this stuff, and unfortunately, records during this era are scarce, and multiple places who claim to make this creation at the same time. A lot of it's the same year, and they all seem to happen between 1880 and 1905.
I mean, honestly, they probably did invent it, but they it's the same thing. It's just a kind of a simple solution.
Like we talked about, putting meat on bread probably is a pretty old idea, so it doesn't seem that crazy. So I'm going to go through a few stories that we're going to talk about that are different claimants to creating and inventing the cheeseburger and the hamburger. And first, we have a story from two people named Frank and Charles Menchie's, who were food vendors at the 1885 County Fair outside of Buffalo, New York, a.k.a. the Hamburg Fair. This legend states that during the fair, the Menchies ran out of their signature menu item, which was pork sausage sandwiches, and their local supplier didn't want to butcher more hogs this late in the year, so he suggested they use ground beef as a substitute, as they had it heavily in supply. The brothers fried it up and found it to taste very dry and bland, so instead they added coffee, brown sugar, cinnamon, some sources say red pepper, to make the meat taste better. And the original sandwich would then be sold with ketchup and onions on top, and they would find success with this, and they ended up calling it the Hamburger after Erie County Fair's hometown of Hamburg, because this is where most Hamburg immigrants lived in New York, was in Buffalo. This does have some documentation, as the 1920s carnival historian, which is a fantastic profession, John C. Kunzog would interview the Menchie's brothers about this story, and it would be published in the book Tanbark and Tinsel, And the National Birth of Burger Day is celebrated in some places on September 18th in honor of this 1885 fair that took place on that same day. So, seems like a pretty solid story.
Yeah.
But here's my problems with it.
All right.
It's always presented cut and dry as fact, but here we go. Firstly, the only account of this story comes from the Menches brothers themselves, so a first-hand account only, which is never a good thing. There is no newspaper or citywide fanfare of this 1885 festival breaking some kind of food norms. Secondly, the FDA hadn't made the Pure Food and Drug Act yet, so why would they be frying ground beef to burnt bland levels? If they were cooks that knew what they were doing, they knew what the Hamburg steak was, especially where they were. They would have just served it raw or rare between the bread.
If I was a journalist, the second that I only got first-hand accounts from them, I'd be throwing this story out.
Yeah, well, it wasn't a journalist. It was a carnival historian. So, yeah, they should know what a Hamburg steak is. So they would have put that probably between bread. That's what you do with ground beef. That was the common thing back then. Lastly, the story this allegedly comes from, the Tanbark and Tinsel book was published in 1970, 50 years after the interview. So that's so much time for a story to be invented or changed or fabricated. So, Menches brothers, I don't know if I trust you.
Get out of here.
Get out of here, Menches brothers. Next, we have the story of Charlie Nagreen from Seymour, Wisconsin. At the age, Wisconsinite. So this is changes, which we'll see what we think about this one. At the age of 15, Charlie would sell Hamburg steaks from a street stall at the annual Outagamie County Fair. Outagamie?
I don't know.
Outagamie? Yeah, 15-year-old boy selling Hamburg steaks. Come get your beef. Perfect. Fine. He would say that eventually he had to stop selling Hamburg steaks, however, because people wanted to walk around the fair and not having to stay at the stall and eat their food. You know, they want to enjoy the fair. You know, which I agree with. When I go to a fair or something and I'm walking around, like there'll be places where you can get chicken and fries or something in like a little paper thing, but it's irritating. You have to kind of stop, or if it's something with like a fork or a knife, you have to stop and cut it up and keep moving. So I get wanting a sandwich.
Corn dogs, hot dogs, hamburgers, pretzels.
Yep, 100%.
For a fair.
Yep, that's you walk around with it. It's bread. You can hold it. It's not gonna destroy your fingers. You know.
Absolutely.
So in response to this, he flattened the steak. He made it very flat and put it between two slices of bread so they could move freely from booth to booth while eating his sandwich. And this became known as the Hamburger Charlie and was sold at the festival until his death in 1951. And to this day, there is a Burger Fest held in the hometown of Seymour in his honor.
That sounds a lot more festive.
Yes. And this story is much more likely to me for a few reasons. One, the burger is made of a Hamburg steak flattened between bread. He didn't cook it. This is not the hamburger we know today. So you can even say this story doesn't matter. But over time, they then took this flattened meat, and then when that 1900 thing happened, they probably cooked it after that. You know, but it already was an established thing. This place you'd go and get something called the Hamburger Charlie.
Yeah, if it was a Pokemon evolution, this is first stage, or this is second stage.
Second stage. Yep, exactly. This is the middle. This is the middle version.
Middle evolution. Yeah.
And so there's no story of overcooking or adding weird things like coffee or cinnamon. It's just put it between bread, flatten it out. People like it. Secondly, there's no date to the story. It happened sometime between 1880 when he started, 1885 or 1880. What did I say?
I don't remember.
Age of 15. I think it was. Oh, I didn't actually say it, but the festival was during the 1880s. So sometime during that place, between after the 1900 when that book was written, was any time they could have, started making it.
And you can always count on a human being to invent something because of utility. The idea that, oh wait, this is an annoying thing to carry around without bread is like, it makes sense.
100%.
Like the first people's story was just because they ran out of what they normally make, so they needed beef. And so magical things happen in sandwich. But this guy was like, fuck, people don't want to walk around with my greasy meat. What if I put it in between bread?
Yeah. Yep, exactly. And okay, here we go. I did put it down. So Charlie Green lived from 1871 to 1951. So he was 15 at the fair, which would have been 1886. So anytime between 1886 to 1900, this could have started being fried into what we know today as the burger. And it never there's another thing to bring up about the story that I like, is it never calls it hamburger, but Hamburger Charlie, which sounds more like a traditional name you'd call a unique hamburger steak made by a guy named Charlie.
Right. Yeah.
That sounds like a fair food. Like fair foods awful. Unique fair foods have weird names, and I think Hamburger Charlie fits that bill.
It does fit. It does sound like a festival food.
The biggest problem with this story is how a county fair specialty from Wisconsin would spread so far and so fast. It's a 50-50 thing. It's just as likely to happen as not happen. But once again, there is no story that has documentation other than word of mouth from this town.
I honestly, like, from all these stories, I just think it's like, you all get credit, because you all kind of...
No, I'm honestly... I'm on the same page with you. I'm on the same page with you.
They all had reasons to invent it. And then when they caught word of each other, they're like, "Oh, you do that too? No shit.
Yeah,
well, I'm patenting it. Fuck you. It's my money."
We'll talk about patents in a second. In a little bit. So there is another story of a man named Fletcher Davis, aka Old Dave, who claimed to have invented the idea of ground beef between two patties of Texas toast, or between two pieces of Texas toast, when one of his customers was in too much of a hurry to sit down for their hamburger steak meal. The customer walked away with his hamburger steak on toast and was so happy with it that Old Dave ended up offering this as a new steak to go menu item.
Sounds pretty realistic.
And it would just call it steak to go. That was the name of it, steak to go. So in the year of 1880 is when this happened, in the city of Athens, Texas. In 1904, Old Dave would have a stall at the St. Louis World Fair, and Texas journalist Frank X. Tolbert mentions in an article on the fair that Fletcher Davis sold hamburgers in a cafe at 115 Tyler Street in Athens, Texas during the late 1880s.
Ooh, that's got documentation.
Yes, it does. So this story has some serious weight to it. Unlike the others, it's heavier for sure. But even then, there are a few things to break down about it. So firstly, Frank X. Tolbert's article mentions the stall serving hamburgers, then references the cafe in Athens selling hamburgers. The key thing is why I'm emphasizing the word hamburger, which indicates by 1904, everyone who would be reading this paper already knew what hamburgers were.
Right. So at that point, it's already invented.
Yes, it was a clearly invented thing at this time. This guy was talking about it in print journalism. He was saying the word hamburger, which you know, a rule for print journalism is you talk simple so everyone knows what you're talking about.
Right.
Secondly, there was locals of Athens documented saying that they do remember the cafe selling beef sandwiches in 1880. So this doesn't necessarily mean it was the hamburger we know today, and it very well may have been similar to the Hamburger Charlie idea, because like he said, he made a hamburger steak to go. So it probably was the same idea. He just had Texas toast because he's in Texas, just slapped it between two giant pieces of fried bread. This
sounds awesome.
Yeah,
that sounds
it sounds fucking amazing. So it probably was, again, a raw or a hamburger steak between bread, and comes down to defining really what a hamburger is at this point. Even then, the 1880 date could be a fabrication just to try to be another claimant to the first hamburger. Because if you're being interviewed for a newspaper, the World's Fair, you're gonna be like, "Yeah, I invented this. I was serving in the 1880s." And so this guy at the World's Fair was like, "Okay, let's go to Athens." And people are like, "Oh yeah, they have been serving beef sandwiches, not hamburgers, beef sandwiches." So you know, there's a little bit of a loophole there. And also, the other thing is, people at this time, this is 1904 when the paper was printed, so he was already, the Mensch's story was in 1920, so it hadn't been talked about yet. But the Hamburger Charlie thing was already a thing, and there probably was, if we already knew what hamburgers were, he could have put the name 1880 as a date, like, to just be like the first. You know, like, yeah, it was first, 1880.
right.
You know, he could have invented that date.
Oh yeah, I mean, again, that's.
Because it puts it just before the other stories, you know, like just before, not unrealistically before, just before.
Yeah.
So yeah, again, if people were called a sandwich, doesn't mean it was a burger. Beef was everywhere during this time, so it could have been literally a roast beef sandwich, you know? So,
Right.
hard to say. However, there is some evidence in the story from other credited sources. In 1980, Dairy Queen Ice Cream filmed a documentary series about the birthplace of the burger, and it tells Old Dave's story as the origin, along with witness interviews. The story of Old Dave's hamburger sandwich, quote unquote, is also available in the Ronald L. McDonald book, The Complete Hamburger. So, of the stories mentioned above, they were also in these books a lot. Like, they talk about the Menchie's brothers, they talk about other stuff, but this is the only one that talked about it as almost like it was the actual one. Like, the documentary and the McDonald's book mention Old Dave's as the original hamburger.
Well, I mean, that's
so, but they tell the other stories too. So again, there's nothing really weighing that down, but it is printed stories of this. So this definitely was a known tale at the time. And I do think it's likely this could be the first one, for sure.
right.
It's possible the original burger was meant as a to-go item, so it was maybe fried to a medium or well-done version of the hamburger steak, so it wouldn't fall out of the bread easy. Because, you know, like if you have like steak tartare, it's very mushy. It falls apart. So like
raw ground beef falls apart, but when it's fried up, it gets congealed. And
yeah, exactly. So it was meant to be like literally eaten while walking down the street or getting out of the store. You would hold together better as a burger patty that's fried. Mm-hmm. So our next story is of Otto Quass, a German cook who created a sailor's sandwich made of fillet of beef patty, fried in butter, and served with fried egg between two toasted buns in 1891 in Hamburg, Germany. The sandwich was called the Deutsches beefsteak, or, you know, German beefsteak, and many sailors on ships between Hamburg and New York would request this style of sandwich in New York City. And that's the end of the story. And I believe it. It's the most believable story to me.
Yeah, that really is.
Because that's the end of the story, and also not really claiming any much. This person is not, they never made a fuss of it. It's just the story. But here's the thing. The ports between New York and Hamburg was the number one European trading port between New York and Germany. So,
I bet.
Or America and Germany. That was the number one thing for like European like traders, was to go from Hamburg to New York. So that was a very popular route for sailors.
Yeah.
And the fact that sailors got these at ports in 1891 and loved it so much it asked for it in America is pretty big. And secondly, it's pretty normal for Americans to want to claim things as theirs originally when it's not.
Sure, money and stuff.
So it's very possible that's what's going on here. And it makes sense that they would start calling it a hamburger because it's from Hamburg. Right. It's just like, that's it. Like, that's a simple logic. Like, oh, it's the hamburger.
Yeah.
Like,
again, like I like we said, it's like they all get some credit to some degree of like forming the modern day burger, and that's what's so kind of annoying about it. It's just like, hey, I know we hate this type of attitude, but can't you all be winners here?
Yeah.
Like,
no, again,
like, you're all winners. You're all winners. You all come up with something great.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, but this is 1891, and it is documented in Germany that this guy was making these. He had a little restaurant on the port, and he was making these things. They were being sold, and they were very popular. So,
sounds good.
We have other claimants too. An example: White Castle claims to invented the hamburger sandwich.
What?
Unsurprisingly, there's no record of this at White Castle. There is also Louis Lassen, which is one of the biggest stories of the thing. This story was one of my most researched ones, and I actually watched an episode of Diners, Drive-Ins, and Drives about this story. Nice. So we'll talk about, and a couple other food channel things have covered this story recently. This is a more recent one, which we're going to talk about. So there's Louis Lassen. This was a Danish immigrant who moved to America in 1880, and what he did was he sold butter and eggs as a street vendor. That was his job.
All right, there you go, buddy.
Next time this is brought up is in 1974.
Wow. Okay.
An interview with the New York Times brought him up as a candidate for in an article they were doing, much like this podcast, as a deep lore dive into the burger origin. New York Times did this big expose on where the burger came from. And this guy was brought up, and no one expected this. Everyone who thought they knew what they were talking about burgers around the country was like, who is Louis Lassen and what are they talking about? In the interview he had with his grandson, he said that he would make a hamburger steak sandwich with small strips of beef for a restaurant known as Lewis's Lunch. Lassen's family states this occurred in 1890, and this had some crazy effects on the story of the burger because people started fighting it. People from these, the other families of these people, like Old Dave and all these other people who had done these documentaries and these books and stuff about the burgers, are like, this is bullshit. If this was a thing, why didn't we know about it? But retaliation came in the form of the grandson, Kenneth Davis Lassen Felt was his name, grandson Lewis, along with his uncle, who showed up to the New York Times office with a notary signed 1900 patent of the hamburger, named the hamburger, and it stresses the difference between the Hamburg steak, a hamburger steak, and the Hamburg sandwich known as the hamburger.
That's just, oh my God. Okay. All right. Let's see what's going on here.
Lewis's Lunch flame broils the patties of the original vertical cast iron gas stoves manufactured by the Bridge and Beach Company in St. Louis, Missouri in 1898, using hinged steel wire gridirons to hold the hamburgers in place vertically, not horizontally, and they cook on both sides at the same time evenly. Lewis's Lunch is still open today, using these same stoves with these same gridirons, making the burgers in the same exact way, with the copies of the patents proudly on display. And this place has been open since the 1800s. It's been featured in multiple shows. If you Google this place, you will find it. You will find YouTube videos of them cooking their burgers. They look, quite frankly, amazing.
I'm sure.
So, with this story, I'm saying right now, confidently, this is the original hamburger. Legally.
Yeah, legally.
Legally.
From a capitalism standpoint.
From a legal standpoint, this is the first hamburger. This is a fact. It cannot be disputed. It has a legitimate patent attached to it, dated 1900. This does not mean, of course, it's the actual first. And it does not discredit any of the stories above, which took place years before. But this does mean that when you make something new, patent it, so this doesn't happen.
Yeah.
It's equally possible that Lewis did invent this on his own, at his own restaurant, or that he took the idea from someone else. What it does, either way, he was a smart one and patented the burger. I do believe we can come to an end of the debate with this story. You can end this story with this thing. You can just say there's a patent. Lewis's Lunch.
Right.
They did it.
Yeah, that's like the Thomas Edison, Nikola Tesla.
Yes, 100%. Very much so. Yeah. Very much so. But yeah, it is literally patented. And unless we have a time machine, this is likely where the story can always end and always come to. So just saying, White Castle, where's your patent? Big company, White Castle. Where's your patent?
Yeah, that's a weird claim. I've never had White Castle burgers, by the way. I don't know.
They're okay. They're not bad. I don't think they're bad at all. They're good. They're very solid. Very simple. Just burger, cheese, and onions. Bam.
Yeah.
You're good. That being said, we're going to go ahead and talk about White Castle a little bit and give them a lot of credit for something. Because in 1921, Edgar Billy Ingram and Walter Anderson opened up the first White Castle. And its name appeared, its name and appearance, you know, their logo and how they're, have you seen a White Castle?
Yes, I've seen one.
They all look the same. And the original one looked like it, and it's not just for show. The White Castle was made the way it is, and even given the name it was, due to the book The Jungle. Because people, again, feared meat and the big meat scandals, and their whole goal was to change that. That was the goal of White Castle. So the buildings are white porcelain tiles and stainless steel to show it's not dirty. If it was dirty, you'd see it, right? So they look super clean. They look almost like hospital sterile. And they became bastions of cleanliness and health in the food industry.
Wow, that's actually pretty incredible because I don't think about that when I think about White Castle.
No, because it's more common nowadays. But back then, they were like, look at us, we're clean, we have burgers, they're not going to make you sick. The meat would be grinded on premise as well, which I don't know if they still are. That might be a thing they do. That's like a famous thing. I don't know. They even had commissioned a medical school to show the health benefits of eating fresh cooked meat.
Okay.
So that's like how serious they were about it. I had this big study come out, and everyone fucking loved White Castle. It exploded. It was all over the place. You know, on the East Coast and Midwest mostly. Not really out here. We don't really have White Castles in the West Coast. But
Not really where I'm from either. They're not really like in Massachusetts or anything. I think the closest one to me is in like southern Connecticut or New Jersey or something.
yeah, I don't know if there is any out here.
Excuse me. Jeez.
But yeah, they're from Kansas, so they're mostly like a South thing, I guess. But I know they're more. Like, I lived in Texas. There was White Castles all over the place, so I know that much. But thanks to the success of White Castle, the oncoming, World War II thing happened. Not thanks to White Castle, but thanks to the success of White Castle after World War II.
Thanks to White Castle.
Yeah.
World War II.
Sorry, that was a weird subject break. I had like a hiccup and it disturbed me. So after World War II, thanks to the success of White Castle, we had a boom in food business that would change the world forever. In 1948, some dudes in California copied White Castle's idea by making a super clean restaurant using the colors red and white to make themselves different instead of blue and white, and they called it In-N-Out Burger.
Oh, I've heard of it.
In-N-Out is out here. People fucking love that shit. I think it's good, but it's not the best. Anyway, people love In-N-Out. It's huge out here, and it's, Bible verses in every wrapper. So the same year, 1948, another place opened up out here called McDonald's.
Ooh.
They also offered very clean burgers with very fast service and locally sourced ingredients, and this made them very popular. These would prove to be so successful in the post-war golden years of the 50s that they would begin expanding across the country. But McDonald's did, not In-N-Out, obviously.
Yeah.
Next, in 1954, we had Burger King open in stores. And then the next major franchise nationwide that opened up is Wendy's in 1969. But the burgers that we know today really formed during this, from the White Castle onward, where they started putting cheese on it firstly, and then ketchup, mustard, pickles, and onions. That was the basic cheeseburger everywhere you went. A lot of different people, of course, claim to put lettuce on it first. I think Burger King actually says they did it first, which is believable if you look at McDonald's, because they don't have lettuce on their burgers. So it's like they wasn't them. Right? No, yeah, the Big Mac has it, but it obviously wasn't like the original burger. So it wasn't them that did it first. It could have been In-N-Out. They were around the same time. They're all about that kind of stuff. So maybe, but that's where burgers kind of formed, and it's kind of thanks to World War II when a lot of Americans went to Europe. The cheeseburger kind of became synonymous with America, like a bald eagle or a cowboy. Like that kind of became like the food staple that Europeans thought of when they thought of American food.
I mean, that's still to this day.
Yeah, 100%.
You're American. You like cheeseburgers.
Yep.
It's like, yeah, it's true. I do.
I do. Yeah, I'm not going to deny that. You do too, and you're lying to me if you don't.
It's true.
But yeah, U.S. armed servicemen in Europe brought the burger with them. They made burgers there themselves, and locals loved it. So locals started making burgers, and then when McDonald's became big enough to go international, every country in the EU wanted a McDonald's, so they got them.
Right.
They literally asked for it. They wanted a McDonald's, like, please make McDonald's here. So they did. It spread like crazy, I'm just gonna go ahead and say, McDonald's destroyed the USSR. So.
Oh yeah, there's the fucking commercial with Gorbachev.
Yeah.
Like,
McDonald's and Pizza Hut stopped the USSR. But as far as Pizza Hut goes, that's the next food episode.
I would love to do a pizza.
That's the next one, 100%. That's the next one. Next food one will be a pizza one. But yeah, the capitalist business of McDonald's went to USSR. It was the first capitalistic business. Pizza Hut followed right after. But it really started the dominoes to fall for people there to be like, oh, this is great. So, like McDonald's, it opened up in 1990 in the Soviet Union. And if you don't know, the Soviet Union collapsed in 92. So it only took 2 years after McDonald's showed up. Ronald came down and showed them what the real red hero was.
I'm not trying to make any statements or anything. I'm not going to get on any soapbox here. But I do believe that food is a doorway to world peace.
100%.
I think, and that's a very small and kind of silly example, but it's but it's true.
Yeah,
I
no,
mean,
you're right. It is a small and silly example, but it
it's
happened.
an example. Like,
Yeah.
people realized that they could have other options, enjoy something from somewhere else, and they were like, "Hey, this is kind of nice."
Yeah.
And even Mr. Gorbachev was just like, "Mr. Gorbachev, put on Dim Pickles." I guess I can't. I was a terrible.
Well, I think that story of McDonald's and uniting the world and cheeseburgers helping everyone come together is the greatest spot we could have to end this episode of Lore Lords.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna order. I am gonna order.
Yeah, I am too. So, everyone, thanks for tuning in this week. I hope you enjoyed our burger history. And now maybe if anyone ever goes to Lewis's Lunch in New York, just eat it. I guess I want to. I want to go there.
I'll do. I would if you can find the top 10 burger places in America to go to, we'll take that. We'll take that road trip.
Oh, let's fucking go, dude. Burgers
Yeah,
around
I
the
would be
world.
down with that.
All right, everyone.
Well, just America to start, but okay, bye.
Have a great night. Thanks for listening. We'll see you.
Good night.